I enjoy watching travel videos, and as a former Tasmanian, I definitely enjoy when people do videos about their trips to Tasmania. Of course, I can't help being cynical about some videos about trips to Tasmania. Now, if you've never been on a holiday to Tasmania, there's a few things you may not be aware of. Or maybe you are aware. But it's not a cheap holiday. Airfares are costly. You can only fly in to either Hobart or Launceston. And from Hobart or Launceston airports, you then have to pay for transport to get into the actual city area. There are shuttle buses, which are the most affordable option, or you can pay a fortune for a taxi. But it's not like you can just jump on a train or a tram or a cheap bus service. Even the shuttle services from the airports to the cities are not so cheap. Likewise, accommodation in Tasmania is expensive compared to travelling in any other state. Unless you've got your own camper van or caravan or something, you can expect to pay a decent amount for accommodation. It's just the way that it is in Tasmania. Part of that is because Tasmania is an expensive place to live. Groceries are way more expensive. Fuel is more expensive. And as for transport, most people need a motor vehicle, a car or a motorbike, to get around. Because there are buses, but it doesn't compare with the other states. It's not an easy state to get around if you don't have your own transport. Now, that said, most people, when they're planning a trip to Tasmania, will, if they're going to spend the money on accommodation, and they know they're spending a decent amount of money on accommodation and airfares, you would expect that people are going to do their research to find out what places they actually want to visit while they're in Tasmania. Is it going to be worth the cost of the airfares and the accommodation? Or if you bring your vehicle, is it going to be worth the cost of the trip on the Spirit of Tasmania and the fuel and accommodation? So my point is, if you're going to head to Tasmania, the initial outlay just for getting there and putting a roof over your head while you're there is going to be significant enough that you want to do your research. You want to know what to expect when you get there, right? So, this video, the reason I'm reviewing this video is because I found it incredibly amusing that someone would go to the expense of travelling to Tasmania without really doing a great deal of research. I haven't used the entire video, but I've put a link in the description so that you can go and watch the video for yourself and make up your own mind.
So you remember how in yesterday's vlog I was talking about how all this really nice weather in Hobart is really uncharacteristic, and I got really lucky about which day I went up Mount Wellington? This is what the weather normally looks like in Hobart.
Okay, first correction. This is coming from a guy who has spent a week in Tasmania and is saying this is what he's normally like in Tasmania. Yes, Tasmania probably has less sunshine than the majority of states. But to say this is what the weather is normally like is somewhat erroneous. Tasmanian weather is extremely changeable, just like Melbourne weather. So it might be overcast in the morning, and then it might be really sunny in the afternoon. It might not necessarily get warm, or you might get a bit of warmth in the middle of the day. But it is not constantly dreary and overcast. This is one of those misconceptions which seems to be put out there and gets people somewhat confused. I've watched a few travel videos where people have done a massive trip to Tasmania and they're like, wow, I can't believe the weather is like this. It's 28 degrees, it's sunny, and I'm going swimming. That happens in Tasmania. You do get nice days. It's just that you don't get consistently nice weather. It's different every day, and it can be different multiple times in one day.
So I'm on my way today to the MONA, which stands for the Museum of Old and New Art, and that acronym has taken me like 2 weeks to remember. And the only way to get there from Hobart is to go to Hobart Central, kind of where I took the bus from yesterday, and take a ferry from there with the river up to the MONA. At least that's the only way to get there without driving and without spending an absurd amount on taxis and Ubers and things like that. So that's where I'm headed this morning.
Wrong again. Now here's a little tip. If you're planning on visiting Tasmania and you haven't got everything perfectly planned out before you get there, Tasmanians are actually very, very friendly people, and they are happy to give you advice. So I had this gentleman asked a Tasmanian for advice. They would have let him know that it was possible to catch a bus from the city to Claremont, where MONA actually is. And that bus would have cost less than $10. Probably only $5. I'm not familiar with the cost of bus fares in Tasmania. But public transport does go from the city to the place where MONA is. You may have to walk a couple of 100 metres, but you can get there cheaply using public transport quite easily. And no, it doesn't run as regularly as public transport does in other states. It's not like being in Melbourne and you just go, okay, well, I'm just going to go to the bus stop because I know there'll be a bus in 5 minutes. The buses do tend to be spread out a little bit more than that. So you do have to at least plan for your times. You have to figure out what time the bus is going to go from what stop and make sure you're there to catch it. Otherwise, you might be waiting half an hour for the next bus. Sure, locals would advise you not to get a taxi from the city centre to MONA because that would cost you a fortune. But it may actually still be cheaper than catching the MONA Roma from the city to MONA. The catamaran is a fun option if you want to make it part of the whole MONA experience. But it's not your only option for getting to MONA if you happen to be in the city and you don't have your own vehicle for transport.
And just as an aside, I filmed a section for yesterday's vlog that I ended up cutting out because it didn't fit in with the rest of the story. But I really want to put it in this vlog. I feel like it makes more sense here. It's talking a little bit about what I've learnt from my time in Tasmania and things I didn't expect and things that I think other travellers should know. So I'm going to put that in here while I'm walking to the ferry, but time is relative within the vlog, doesn't matter. I'm going to put it in here and I'll see you when I get to the ferry. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my experience in Tasmania so far and the things that I've learned / didn't expect. Because I've been here a week now today. Today is a week since I've been in Tasmania. I leave on Sunday, so I've learned a lot of things, and that's mostly because I didn't really do a lot of research myself. I bought plane tickets and I bought bus tickets between cities, and that's it. So I learned a lot over the past week, and I thought I'd share that knowledge on to you.
Okay, going back to what I said. If you're going to head down to Tasmania for a holiday, it's really a good idea to do your research before you go. Because spending a bucket load of money on airfares and for buses between the two cities, but not doing your research, is really a waste of money. If it's going to mean that you're stranded only being able to do things in the two cities because you didn't actually research anything about the state and you don't know what it's like trying to get around in Tasmania. Anyone who's visited Tasmania will tell you it is very, very different from the other states.
First thing I learned is that Tasmania has almost zero public transport. There's like buses within cities and buses that go between cities, but that's it. There's no trains, there's no trams, there's no intercity trains, there's no simple ways to get, for example, one of the biggest attractions here in Hobart is the Mona. There's no bus service that goes from central Hobart to the Mona. You can either get a taxi or an Uber, or you can walk the 9 kilometers, or you can take a ferry and go all the way around. So that's the first thing. There's no like really functional public transport system here.
Let's talk about that. Okay, first of all, no, you can't get a bus to every single location in Tasmania. Tasmania is actually bigger than what you realise. But you can actually book a bus tour. There are day trips that go places like Port Arthur. You can book ahead. You just need to make sure that you stick to the timetable. There are plenty of day trips that you can do with tour buses. There are also plenty of things that you can do within the Hobart area that you can access using regular public transport. Of course, if you are going to head to Tasmania and you're not planning on renting a car for the entire time, if there are places that you particularly want to go to and you can't find a bus tour to get to them, you may want to consider hiring a car for a few days. Perhaps you don't hire a car for the full time that you are there, but a few days, and you can go to the places that you can't access by bus. And if you've got a car for a few days, then you can book accommodation that's further out of the city and cheaper than what you would be paying in the centre of Hobart or in the centre of Launceston. So you will be saving some money on your accommodation, which will offset some of the cost of a rental car. Of course, if you go in tourist season, there's going to be more tour buses available going to more locations than there will be in the middle of winter. Simply because it is bloody freezing in Tasmania in the middle of winter. So you don't necessarily get as many tourists going there. But if you find yourself landed in Tasmania and you haven't made any plans, and you do want to go somewhere other than around the centre of the city, have a chat with the staff at the place where you're staying. Because chances are they can recommend places for you to go to, or they can tell you how to get to places that you have in mind. It's definitely not easy getting around Tasmania without a vehicle. And personally, I think if you're going to save up and make a trip to Tasmania, then you are better off either heading down on the Spirit of Tasmania with your own vehicle, or allowing money in your budget to rent a vehicle, because you will have a much more enjoyable experience. But at the same time, there are still plenty of places that you can get to using tour buses. And if you're only staying for a week or two, trust me, you could fill up pretty much every day that you are there visiting different locations within the state, just using public transport and tour buses.
Second thing is that whatever size you think a city in Tasmania is going to be, shrink it like 3 times. That's how big it is. And then imagine where you'd think all of the attractions are, and then put them 3 times further out from the centre of the city. That's what every city I've been to in Tasmania has been like so far. Everything is so spread out, and there's no simple way of getting anywhere.
There seems to be this enduring idea by people who've never been to Tasmania that you can do the entire state in one day, or that you can do it within a very short amount of time, and that everything is very close together. There's a reason that they talk about ecotourism when it comes to Tasmania. A very, very large amount of Tasmania is bush or beaches or rivers or lakes. The cities are separated by large areas of country. So yes, if you go to Tasmania, the cities aren't huge in comparison with cities in other states. And I will just mention this guy is like every city I've been to. There's actually more than just 2 cities in Tasmania. And I think if you were to head to some of the other smaller cities, you may find attractions that are slightly closer, simply because they are smaller cities, and therefore there is less travel between them and the other attractions. However, people need to realise if you're going to Tasmania, it is actually much bigger than you realise. And the cities only do take up a small amount of space within Tasmania. So, yes, to go to places that are popular tourist places, it is a little ways out of the cities. It's worth knowing this before you go to Tasmania so that you're not sitting in the middle of Hobart and complaining that Hobart is a teeny tiny city and that you can't get anywhere because everything is so far out.
And the third thing that I learned, and this is probably the one that I was least prepared for, was obviously Tasmania is a wealth of nature and wilderness and beauty, and that's why people come here. That's what I've loved. That's been my favourite moments of this trip, is being out in nature. But what I wasn't prepared for was how difficult it was going to be to get to those places. Tasmania is a road trip state. It's a place that you rent a car or you borrow a car and you road trip around. It's not a place that you do what I'm doing, which is just go to a city and use public transport and explore the city and the outer bounds. It's not built for that.
As I mentioned before, it is an expensive holiday to go to Tasmania. So if you're planning a Tasmanian holiday, then you probably are better off planning for the expense of having a vehicle while you are there, either by taking your own vehicle with you on the Spirit of Tasmania or hiring a vehicle while you are there. But don't let that turn you off from going there and make you think that if you go there and you don't have access to a vehicle, that you're going to see none of the state, that you're going to be stuck in the cities. Because like I mentioned, there are options. There are day tours. The image that I showed before was only one company. I looked on Google for less than a minute and came up with that. There are plenty of ways for you to entertain yourself in Tasmania without a vehicle. You may not necessarily get to all the really far out locations that are there. But to be honest, if you did want to get to all those locations that were further out, then you're probably going to be planning for a longer stay in Tasmania as it is, in which case you're probably also going to be planning to head down with a vehicle, because you will have done your planning and you will know that you're going to see very little of Tasmania in the space of a week or 2 weeks. So the takeaway here is, yes, you are better off visiting Tasmania and having access to a vehicle, but if you're only planning on going for a week or 2 weeks, you can fill every single day with different experiences, simply through the use of public transport and through the use of tours which are provided.
But with all that said, my experience over the past week in Tasmania has been nothing but good, bar all the little public transport issues. It is beautiful here, and all of my favourite moments have been in nature and out in places.
Provided that you rug up properly, and if you are from a warmer state, you might want to invest in some thermals. But provided that you rug up properly, there's plenty of outdoor experiences in Tasmania. It is a beautiful place. It's definitely worth going to, and you can enjoy it even without a vehicle.
I think those big camouflage ships behind me are the Mona ferries. That feels like overkill. There's a guy back here filming something. I have no idea what it is, but it looks cool. Normally I would ask him, but I do not have the time to stop. I am going to be late and miss the ferry that I spent $35 on.
Okay, definitely not overkill having those catamarans for travelling to Mona. I guess, for starters, the idea is that if you are going to catch a ferry to Mona, then you want to be able to experience the actual museum when you get there as well, rather than be sitting outside on a bench feeling travel sick for the next couple of hours before you have to get back on the ferry and travel back to Hobart and make yourself feel even more unwell. The thing is, even though the Derwent is just a river, it is actually quite a large river, and it can cut up quite a bit at times. So it can sometimes be a rough ride. And of course, the other side of it is that the catamaran would have been built in Tasmania. So not only is it providing a service, but it is also supporting Tasmanian business. It is a way of promoting what Tasmania can actually do and what Tasmania can actually export. And of course, with Mona becoming more and more well-known and popular, having a small catamaran for travelling up the Derwent to Mona is efficient. It's a quick way of getting there rather than on a small ferry, and it's definitely a comfortable way of getting there. But $35 for the ferry, it's definitely an experience that you should do if you are happy to be spending the money on the cost of a small cruise. It's enjoyable going for a bit of a ride out on the Derwent. There's certainly beautiful sights to be seen. But like I said, you can do it far more cheaply. You can get a bus from the city centre to Claremont, where Mona is, and walk a very short distance to Mona. In peak season, there probably are buses which travel from the city to Mona. So the ferry is definitely not your only option. It is possibly the most expensive option, but it's not your only option.
This is the coolest staircase I've ever been on. Man, there's really this whole island building thing with spiral staircases feels like I'm about to enter some like supervillain secret laboratory. Right? That's not just me. Sick. This thing is really, really cool. I've made the decision that I'm not going to show you, I'm not going to do what I normally do in art galleries, which is show you all the things that I like, because this is such a gallery that deserves to be experienced and not just seen through one of my vlogs. But I will show you some of the cool, like specifically, like installation things like this, and experience the building and area with me. I just want to show you like specific art pieces, or a lot of the specific art pieces. Yeah, I'm going to go to the next section now.
So worth knowing, first of all, Mona is not an island. It's actually built on a small isthmus. In other words, it's a little bit of land that pokes out from the rest of the area. And the reason why he's going down those stairs, and you can see all the sandstone behind him, is that the majority of Mona is actually underground. It's actually a fantastic experience just to go around and appreciate the architecture of the place. I find it to be a bit of a shame that he hasn't shared more of what you can see in Mona, but at the same time, I did watch another blog some time back, and they actually claimed that they weren't allowed to film inside Mona. However, I've been there myself, and when I went there, I took multiple photos while I was there, and there was no issues with taking photos. So it would be nice to see someone doing a travel blog in future that perhaps they might take photos while they're in there, or short videos using their phone. Perhaps Mona doesn't allow larger cameras in there. Some places are like that. But my experience in the past has been that they have no problems with you taking photos or short videos using a mobile phone. So the reason I say this is because there is this enduring notion that Mona is all about artwork that is confronting, artwork that for some people is a little bit too risque. The thing is, there are a few displays like that. There's apparently a room of penises, and a few other different rooms like that. But the thing is, the way it's set up, it's actually set up in a very respectful way. So those rooms are actually, they are rooms. So you can choose to avoid going in those rooms, and there's plenty more to see that is just amazing. There's some pretty fantastic sculptures. There's some installations like what he showed. And you can still spend several hours looking at some pretty phenomenal stuff, including some pretty amazing historical stuff. The background of Mona is that it was actually set up by a Tasmanian millionaire. It's his own personal museum, which is open to the public. I don't know if if it still goes that way, but if you're Tasmanian, you get in for free. Otherwise, visitors from other states pay to go in. But yeah, it is a shame that he didn't show you what the inside of Mona really is like, because it's not the scandalous museum that people have been led to believe. It is such a fantastic experience, and something that I would highly recommend for anybody visiting Tasmania. It is a world-class museum. I'm going to wrap it up there, simply because the video already is becoming quite long. But the link for this man's video is in the description for my video. Go and watch it. Just keep in mind the things that I've mentioned. I will mention one more thing before I sign off, and that is, at the end of his video, he sets up a drone. He's still at Mona, and he sends up a drone while he's on the grounds of Mona. And he makes a thing about it being something that he hasn't asked permission to do. But he's basically saying that he's okay with breaking the law if it gets him the ultimate shot. To this I say, if you are doing a travel vlog and you are in a place, it's respectful to ask permission to put a drone up. Mona is actually surrounded by a residential area. So it's possible that you shouldn't be putting a drone up there because you are going to be flying over people's backyards. The other thing is, if people put up drones in areas where they shouldn't do, there's going to come a time where people visiting places like Tasmania won't be allowed to take drones in with them. And there'll be fewer and fewer places where people are allowed to fly their drones. When you go somewhere, I think you need to be respectful of the place that you are going to. And that means being respectful of laws and what is requested of you. I hope you enjoyed my video. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and hit the like button.